Most mornings in Shorehaven began the same way. The sleepy coastal town stirred slowly, coffee brewing, fishing boats humming to life, and one old man stepping out of his weathered white cottage overlooking the harbor. His name was Edward Barnes, but everyone just called him Eddie. Eddie was 74. His back was slightly hunched, his walk measured and deliberate. But his eyes, faded blue and always scanning the horizon, still held the sharpness of a man who had once stared down the stormiest seas. For the last 40 years, Eddie had lived quietly on the edge of town. He wasn't rich. He didn't need to be. His wealth was in the ocean, the rhythm of the tide, the creak of old wood underfoot, and the boat he built with his own hands, the Windward Son. She wasn't much to look at anymore. The paint had long faded under sun and salt. The sails had been patched more times than anyone could count. But to Eddie, she was everything. She wasn't just a boat. She was therapy. She was memory. She was home. Eddie had started building her the year he came back from the war. Vietnam had left scars, some on his body, many more on his mind. He never spoke about it. Not to the locals. Not even to his grandson. But those who lived near the docks knew that on quiet nights, if the wind was right, you could sometimes hear him yelling in his sleep. Still, every morning, without fail, he'd take the Windward Son out to sea. Just before dawn. Just to feel the ocean again. Just to remember who he was. At the stern of his boat flew a tattered but proud American flag. It had flown there every day since the boat first launched. Rain or shine, calm or storm. Eddie never skipped a day. Most people passed him without a second glance. In a town increasingly overrun with vacation condos and rooftop bars, Eddie looked like a forgotten part of a fading world. But there was dignity in his silence. There was history in his hands. There was a story in that boat, one no one had taken the time to hear. Not yet. It was just after 5 a.m. Eddie had already checked his crab pots and was steering the Windward Son toward his favorite mooring spot near the harbor mouth, a place he had anchored for decades. He moved like clockwork, each rope tied with precision, each motion slow but sure. He had just tightened the last knot when he heard it. A low, thunderous hum vibrating through the water. He looked up, squinting into the morning light, and saw it. A massive white shape rounded the far bend of the harbor. 3 stories tall. Gleaming metal. Waves slicing from its hull like knives. It was the Odyssey, a $40 million super yacht belonging to Carter Wells, 38 years old, tech tycoon, recently crowned the golden savior of Shorehaven by real estate investors. Wells had bought half the beachfront last year, promising jobs and tourism. But locals knew better. Since his arrival, working-class families had been priced out, fishermen displaced. Now his yacht was the biggest thing in town, literally. Eddie didn't hate him. He just stayed out of the way. Until today. He waved both arms above his head. "Hey, I'm moored here." No response. He whistled. Shouted. Still nothing. On the upper deck of the Odyssey, Carter Wells and his entourage of socialites clinked champagne flutes and took selfies with the sunrise. The yacht didn't even slow down. The harbor security boat floated nearby. The officer inside looked nervous but said and did nothing. And then it happened. Crunch. The steel bow of the yacht crushed into the Windward Son like a boot to a twig. The stern splintered. Wood flew. A terrible groan echoed across the water. Eddie stumbled, nearly falling, and leapt to the dock just as the boat broke apart beneath him. The American flag he'd raised every morning for 40 years tore from its mount and sank into the churning wake. The engines finally cut. From the upper deck, Carter Wells looked annoyed. "What is this, some kind of antique? Man, you should have retired that thing years ago." Eddie said nothing. He limped to the edge of the dock, knelt slowly, and reached down with shaking hands to pull the wet flag from the water. He cradled it against his chest like a wounded friend. All around him, people had gathered, joggers, dog walkers, tourists, phones raised, recording. No one stepped forward. No one helped. No one spoke. A woman laughed. Someone uploaded the video with the caption, "Old man plus old boat equals big fail." Hashtag boomer down. By midday, it was viral. The town moved on. The wreckage was hauled away. The dock swept clean. No one stopped to ask Eddie if he was okay. That night, back at home, Eddie sat at his small kitchen table. In front of him was his old naval logbook. Page after page of weather reports, tide notes, fish counts. On a blank line, he wrote, "Day 1 without the Windward Son. No apologies given. No loss reported. But the sea still speaks." Then he closed the book, turned off the light, and listened to the silence. The morning after the wreck, the harbor lay in silence. The fog rolled in thick like a veil drawn by the sea itself. Boats stayed moored. Shops hadn't opened yet. and Eddie Barnes sat alone on his porch, a mug of untouched coffee cooling in his hands. He hadn't slept. He couldn't. There was nowhere to go. No boat to ready. No wind to chase. The rhythm that had steadied his life for 4 decades was broken. Then came a sound he hadn't heard in years. 3 long, low blasts from the harbor's foghorn. Eddie's spine straightened. That signal, it wasn't for pleasure craft. He stepped forward, squinting into the gray. Shadows moved. Shapes emerged. And then he saw them. 1, 2, 3. 6 U.S. Navy ships cutting through the fog like ghosts. Steel gray, sharp-lined, disciplined. No ceremony. No loudspeakers. No news crews. Just silence. But it was the kind of silence that carried meaning. Each ship flew the American flag at half-mast. Word spread quickly. Families poured from their homes. Shopkeepers flipped signs to closed and headed for the docks. Children were pulled from summer camps and hushed by parents who didn't yet understand but felt this was important. Eddie watched from the bluff. Confused. Motionless. There'd been no announcement. No warning. But deep in his bones, he knew. The lead destroyer docked with crisp precision. At its helm stood a man Eddie recognized from a photograph long ago, Rear Admiral Patrick Nolan, now in full dress whites. His uniform immaculate, his expression solemn. In his gloved hands, a perfectly folded flag, navy blue and stars folded in the shape that every veteran knows. Admiral Nolan descended the gangway. The crowd parted around Eddie as he walked, each step slower than the last, his cane steadying him. The Admiral stopped before him, straightened to full posture, and saluted sharply. Chief Petty Officer Edward Barnes. Permission to come ashore and render honors. Eddie's voice didn't waver. Permission granted, Admiral. Behind Nolan came a full color guard. 6 sailors each holding a salute. On every ship behind them, crew members lined the decks, standing at attention, facing shore. And then Admiral Nolan turned to the crowd. 45 years ago, he began, his voice firm and clear. This man was serving aboard the USS Sentinel during a storm in the South China Sea. A reactor coolant leak triggered emergency shutdowns. Chief Barnes, against protocol and at great personal risk, entered the lower deck to manually seal a failing valve, saving 127 lives. Gasps. Whispers. Eyes turned to Eddie, many noticing for the first time the faint burn scars on his hands, his neck. He refused the Navy Cross. Declined public recognition. Asked only one thing, take care of the boys who didn't make it home. Admiral Nolan paused. His voice softened. Yesterday, this man's boat, his refuge, was destroyed. No one offered assistance. No one raised a hand. The flag he flew for 40 years was allowed to sink. He nodded to a young sailor who stepped forward with a wooden plaque, polished and brass-edged, engraved with words from a decommissioned destroyer. For the man who kept the sea safe even after service. Eddie accepted it with both hands, staring into the metal, not saying a word. And so, the Admiral continued, we are here not just to remember his service in war, but his dignity in peace. To tell this town and the world watching now that the Navy does not forget its own. Across the harbor, the sailors on every ship raised their salutes. The color guard unfolded the flag and held it high. And in that stillness, where once there had been ridicule, silence now became reverence. Someone began live streaming. The video, now titled #VeteranSalute, began trending within the hour. The man who had been mocked as a relic was now being honored as a hero. At the edge of the crowd on his now quiet yacht, Carter Wells watched. For the first time since arriving in Shorehaven, he looked unsure. His guests were silent. The champagne forgotten. As the Admiral stepped closer, he placed a hand gently on Eddie's shoulder. Your grandson reached out to the Navy Alumni Network. That's how we found you. Why didn't you call us yourself? Eddie shook his head slowly. Wasn't your problem, Admiral? It was just a boat. Nolan replied without hesitation. No, Chief. It was never just a boat. And you were never just a sailor. The ceremony ended, but something had shifted. As the sailors stood down and the color guard folded their flags, the townspeople stayed. One by one, they approached Eddie Barnes, not as strangers, not as spectators, but as neighbors finally waking up. Some offered handshakes. Others simply said thank you. A few hugged him. Apologized. Cried. The harbor master stepped forward with a leather-bound folder. Mr. Barnes, lifetime fishing permit. No fees. No renewals. No questions. The marina owner followed. You'll have a slip here permanently. Free of charge. For whatever boat you choose. Eddie didn't say much. He nodded. His eyes stayed fixed on the sea. But something in his expression softened. The lines on his face, carved from years of quiet endurance, finally relaxed, if only a little. Later that afternoon, a black car pulled up quietly at the edge of the dock. Carter Wells stepped out alone. No security, no entourage, no sunglasses to hide behind. He looked different. Less polished. Less sure. Eddie was sitting on a bench nearby, the folded flag beside him. Wells approached slowly, holding an envelope. "Mr. Barnes." He hesitated. "I came to apologize. My behavior was unacceptable." Eddie didn't respond. Wells held out the envelope. "There's a blank check inside. Whatever amount you think is fair for the boat, the damage, the disrespect. Just write the number. I'll cover it." Eddie looked at the envelope and let it fall to the bench between them. "Money won't rebuild what was lost." Wells swallowed. "Then tell me what will." There was silence. Only the sound of waves lapping against the dock. Finally, Eddie spoke. "There's a spot on the eastern pier. It faces the sunrise. Put a bench there. A solid one. Make it teak if you can. Carve 3 words into it. Sit. Remember. Thank." Wells blinked. He'd expected anger. Demands. Maybe even revenge. "That's it?" he asked. "That's it," Eddie said. "Some things aren't meant to be repaid. Only remembered." 2 days later, Carter Wells was back, this time in work gloves. Alongside a master woodworker from Seattle, he helped install a beautifully carved teak bench overlooking the water. His manicured hands blistered in the heat, but he didn't complain. The bench was placed exactly where Eddie had described. Facing east. Facing the rising sun. Etched into the bronze plaque were the words, "Sit. Remember. Thank." As they tightened the last bolts, a small group of children gathered nearby. Eddie sat down and began tying a rope into a bowline knot. "Been saving sailors since before Columbus," he said, his fingers moving with practiced ease. A little girl named Olivia, around 7 years old, sat beside him and watched. "Are you mad at the man who broke your boat?" she asked suddenly. Eddie paused. Looked out at the new bench. The pier. The sea. "No," he said at last. "If it weren't for him, maybe no one would have remembered that boat ever existed." The girl nodded, as if she understood something most adults never would. And for the first time in a long while, Eddie Barnes smiled. Eddie Barnes never asked to become a symbol. But in the weeks that followed the Navy's silent salute, that's exactly what he became. He no longer fished. Not with the Windward Son gone. But each afternoon, he came to the dock with a coil of rope and a folding stool. He showed the town's children how to tie a bowline, how to read cloud patterns, how to respect the ocean, not conquer it. His stories weren't long, and he didn't dramatize anything. But when he spoke, the kids leaned in. Not because he was loud, but because he was true. The bench with its 3 simple words, "Sit. Remember. Thank." became something of a quiet pilgrimage. Tourists sat on it without knowing the full story. Locals paused there in the evenings watching the tide. And then, one bright Saturday morning, a surprise. The entire town gathered at the harbor, summoned by whispers of something big. A small wooden boat was being towed in, freshly built, gleaming in the sun. The shape was unmistakable, classic lines, handcrafted hull, traditional rigging. But with a few subtle upgrades, modern navigation, reinforced beams. On the stern, painted in dark blue script, "Liberty's Child." At the helm stood Eddie's grandson, Michael, grinning from ear to ear. "Surprise, Grandpa," he called. "We built her for you." Eddie stood frozen. His lips parted but no words came. Michael beamed. "I found your old plans in the shed. The Boat Builders Association donated the wood. Veterans from 4 states helped. Everyone pitched in." The new vessel nudged up to the dock. Eddie stepped aboard. His old sea legs responded instantly, body finding balance as if he'd never left the water. He ran his fingers along the polished rail. At the bow, a crisp American flag fluttered in the wind. Michael stood beside him. "She's not the same, I know. But her soul came from you." Eddie didn't speak. He just nodded, blinking fast. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Eddie sat once more on the teak bench. A young family stood nearby. Their child, pointing to the plaque, asked, "Daddy, what does it mean?" The father smiled. "It means we should stop sometimes. And remember the people who made our lives possible." Eddie looked out to sea. The horizon was calm. The wind was steady. And for the first time in a long, long while, his chest didn't feel empty. He wasn't trying to be remembered. But the sea had remembered him anyway.